Kalimera. Good morning, everyone. Kalimera. After a wonderful, fruitful day yesterday, we continue. We continue with my honorable colleague. Yesterday I've learned this, addressing people with honorable, so I should use it more often. Christoph Rapp from the University of Munich, who will talk to us about philosophy city Aristotle, and it was time to move from Plato to Aristotle today, so thank you very much.
Thank you, my honorable friend. Kalimera, so as the director of another master program in ancient philosophy, I came to Athens in order to convey my congratulations and best wishes. Because there's not so much that I could add to yesterday's encomia, I would like to use this opportunity to file a complaint. I think that the idea of studying ancient philosophy in Athens with this impressive lineup of Greek experts is so attractive and convincing that it is almost unfair to competing programs in the world. So while we in Munich have to attract students by praising the pleasures of the Munich October Beer Festival, which by the way is great. I was there on Monday. You should come next time. So you folks in Athens, you can promote your program just by referring to the genius loci of Athens, which is almost omnipresent here. So here are the remains of Plato's Academy. Here was Epicurus' garden. And look over there. This was Socrates' prison, where he met his friends for the last time. And down here, close to the metro tracks, Chrysippus invented propositional logic. Last but not least, this is the public spot the cynic philosopher Diogenes used to urinate upon. All this is very fascinating, and I wish we would have more of this in Munich. But, I mean, the experience of genius loci is a highly subjective and sometimes illusionary affair. I mean, take the example of Stagera. Before the real ancient Stagera was discovered in the 1990s, Aristotelians kept traveling to a homonymous village on the Chalkidiki, totally unrelated to Aristotle and his family, and still they reported that they could feel the spirit of Aristotle. So the question is whether there's something more substantial to the relation between Athens and philosophy than genius loci. And in yesterday's talks, we already heard a lot about parousia and an inspiring environment, and I think this is very important. But one could object that these are only necessary or enabling conditions. And I'm also interested in the question whether there's a more intrinsic relation between Athens and philosophy. And for that purpose, I chose the example, as so many others, of political philosophy. This time, Aristotle's discussion of democracy. So, Aristotle's theory of democracy, as his political philosophy in general, is very complex. It cannot be condensed into simple slogans. His political thinking includes quite different strands, some of which seems to be in tension with each other. If scholars pick out only one of these strands in isolation, they arrive at strong, quotable theses, which however do not justice to his sometimes partial but always differentiated assessment of various political systems. Aristotle is neither a social democrat by conviction, nor is he an unreflecting or snobbish aristocrat. This complexity of political thought, also I'm going to argue, mirrors the fact that the collection we know as Aristotle's Politics presents us with the attempt to reconcile certain philosophical ideas and presuppositions or the nature of the state, so picture of eudaimonia, etc., to reconcile these philosophical ideas with what Aristotle takes to be political reality. And his picture of political reality, again, is informed by his empirical, historical studies manifested in the collection of 158 constitutions he organized and by the observation of contemporary developments. Wherever political reality enters the picture, philosophical accounts of political constitutions need to be made more differentiated and flexible. This might be the main reason why ideal constitutions or idealized pictures of non-ideal constitutions do not play a major role in Aristotle's politics. Another reason might be given by Aristotle's idea that not each constitution is suitable for each body of citizens. It follows from this approach to political affairs that all general descriptions of political systems and institutions must be differentiated in accordance with different types of political, societal orders and must be harmonized, with the particular constraints holding for cities with a specific citizenry and a peculiar history. This general tendency of Aristotle's politics applies both to the descriptive and the evaluative level. On the descriptive level, it is not enough to content oneself with the general standard description of political constitutions, democracy, monarchy, oligarchy, because it makes all the difference in Aristotle's view of what type of democracy or oligarchy we are speaking. Even though the opening of the politics is famous for its general anthropological statements about human beings as social and political animals and about eudaimonia as the ultimate goal and raison d'etre of each polis, these anthropological remarks only offer very general standards for the assessment of cities, but are too vague to advise the lawgiver on the design of particular institutions. Against this background, Aristotle's politics is not a good source for general slogans about particular types of constitutions. And whenever we are presented with general slogans allegedly deriving from Aristotle's politics, we should be alerted. The same is true for the treatment of democracy in Aristotle's politics. When scholars characterize Aristotle either as whole-hearted democrat or as hard-boiled aristocrat or anti-democrat, one can be sure that it is an oversimplification. And with regard to democracy, it can be argued that a fair amount of the highly differentiated descriptions and assessments that make it so difficult to pinpoint Aristotle's attitude to democracy is actually inspired by Athenian politics, both by the history of Athenian democracy as Aristotle sees it, and by the first-hand experience he made with Athenian democracy in the 4th century. Aristotle's Athenaion Politeia documents his interpretation of the development of the Athenian democracy down to his own lifetime. Even if Aristotle himself was not the author of this work, it is likely that he commissioned students close to him and familiar with his own views with the collection of the various constitutions. At any rate, it seems clear that the Athenaion Politeia offers many details that support the claims that the politics makes about Athenian democracy. In what follows, I will address some of Aristotle's misgivings about democracy, but will also address some of the arguments that he offers in favor of democratic participation. In particular, I will highlight passages suggesting that some sort of participation is required for each and every polis in accordance with the nature of a polis, which offers a strong support, at least, for the inclusion of democratic elements in each and every constitution. It would be nice if I could say at this particular occasion that it was here in Athens that Aristotle eventually overcame his concerns about democracy and finally endorsed democratic constitutions wholeheartedly. But again, things are more complicated. The inspirations he drew from Athenian democracy point in both directions. He regularly refers to Solon's constitution as a role model for the moderate and hence, as he thinks, stable version of democracy. But he also uses Athenian history to demonstrate the threats of what he takes to be exaggerated democracy. Similarly, he seems to interpret the current constitution he experiences during his 2 days stays in Athens as the kind of extreme version of democracy he finds objectionable. But at the same time, he also finds here plenty of, as it were, innocent ways of political participation that he, in principle, endorses. So, with this preliminary remarks in place, let's get started with the philosophical issues. For Aristotle, a city-state or polis is defined by a collective intention. For he says in Book 1 of the Politics that the polis is established and exists for the sake of living well. Saying that a community is established with a view to a specific good is equivalent to saying that the people who found it or who make up this community established it with a view to a specific good. There is no intentionality of the political institution apart from the intentionality of its personal members, for intentions require a soul, and the state has no soul on its own unless in a metaphorical sense. There's a recent publication in CUP that argues for the soul of the city, which I find quite funny, because the soul, after all, is not the living people. Hence, it is the collective intention of the founders or citizens of a city that define the city's purpose. To enable self-sufficiency and thus to provide a precondition for living well is part of its essence. Communities with different purposes, military alliances or trading associations that exist for the sake of self-defense or commercial gain do not qualify as polis. The city's purpose corresponds to the intention of the people who live in this particular community. Human beings join the life in the city neither arbitrarily nor contrary to their nature, but in accordance with their nature and their natural striving for happiness and good life. This is how I interpret the slogan that the polis exists by nature. For these reasons, constitutions that fail to promote the happiness of their citizens or systematically exclude part of the citizenry from the good life, when, for example, they are governed only for the benefit of the ruling group, are treated as deviant, namely as deviating from the nature and essence of a city. They do not match up to what it means to be a city, namely to exist for the sake of the citizens' well-being. When criticizing Plato's Republic in Book 2, Aristotle makes it also clear that it does not even make sense to speak of a city's happiness or well-being unless the citizens, or major parts of the citizenry, are happy. It follows already from these basic ideas that those members or citizens for the sake of whose happiness the city exists must have something in common, apart from just dwelling in the same place, and must partake in one way or the other in the activities of the city. This is why in Politics 3.1 Aristotle defines the citizen as one who, quote, is entitled to take part in the deliberative or judicial administration of a state. Accordingly, it follows from Aristotle's basic understanding of a city and citizenship that citizens performing various and complementary functions within the city cannot be excluded from all decisions, not even in cities that are not organized in a straightforwardly democratic way. The same follows from Aristotle's distinction between despotic or parental rule on the one hand and political rule on the other. Aristotle insists on this distinction against the thesis in Plato's Statesman. According to Aristotle, people who are free and free-born cannot be governed like children or slaves. Once people are excluded from all decisions and are not granted any kind of political participation, a city would gradually shift to treating them as unfree and to establish a despotic rule. Again, we encounter the thought that it is important for a constitution to define ways in which its citizens can participate in one way or the other, and that this requirement follows, in a sense, from the very idea of the city, citizen, and political rule. In this latter sense, Aristotle credits Solon with the achievement of having liberated the Athenian demos from its slavish existence by giving people access to the judicial system. When people are free, they contribute to the life of the city by their own deliberations and choices for Irisans. And they want their choices and preferences to be heard. Otherwise, they feel excluded from the community. And there is the risk, as Aristotle puts it, that they behave like inner enemies. At any rate, they won't find the current constitution agreeable and will hence not contribute to its preservation. It is therefore a major issue in Aristotle's politics to determine a just and appropriate amount of participation, especially since different types of constitutions differ, above all, in how they organize the participation. Even within one and the same city and constitution, different societal groups disagree on how much relative participation they deserve. The rich ones claim that their share in the administration of the city should correspond to their wealth and the money they contribute to the city. Aristotle finds that the rich ones notoriously overestimate their contribution, as it is not the city's purpose to attain the greatest fortune, but to attain happiness. And for this latter purpose, wealth is only a necessary condition, while virtue and education provide the superior kind of contribution. This is why Aristotle is in principle more sympathetic with the claim of the virtuous and educated ones to have a proportionally greater share in the administration of the city, since he also supports, as we will see, the idea that the capable and better ones should rule. Still, no amount of individual virtue and capability can override, outdo the legitimacy of those citizens' claim who do not exceed in virtue and education or in wealth. This latter group of citizens, who is poor, this latter group of citizens who are poor and mostly uneducated, but free, insists that political participation must not be distributed in accordance with merit or additional qualifications such as wealth and virtue, but in accordance with numeric as opposed to proportional or geometric equality. The underlying claim is that whoever is free should have an equal share in the administration of the city, just because they are free or free-born, and because this social status of freedom does not allow of decrease. Freedom in this context is not an achievement or a psychological state. It is just the status of someone who descends from free parents. Whether both parents have to be free and what kind of evidence must be provided for the parent's identity differ from city to city. Under certain circumstances, it might be politically opportune to be more generous in acknowledging people as free and as citizens, for example, in order to increase the body of citizens. Sometimes, though, Aristotle seems to expect that the social status of freedom comes with a certain minimal qualification, namely the qualification to actually make use of the faculty of choice. This becomes obvious when he complains that under certain historical circumstances, citizenship was granted to overly slavish people, as he notoriously puts it. These quibbles aside, it is undisputed that the status of being an acknowledged freeborn citizen crowns the legitimate expectation to be ruled politically and not despotically. And political ruling implies that the ruled subjects are acknowledged as responsible agents who aspire to have a say in the administration of the city. However, this status neither determines the kind or the amount of participation. In principle, there is, as we learn from the Politics and the Athenaeum Politeia, a wide range of possibilities to participate in the administration of a city. Passive and active electoral rights, access to the assembly, access to the courts, calling to account the magistrates, assessing the public buildings, assessing the temples and the horses, controlling the measures used by the merchants, controlling the prisons, controlling the marketplaces, etc. All these are possible ways of political participation. To some extent, the distribution of rights to political participation is a question of justice. If, say, the themos' access to offices and decision-making institutions is unduly restricted, this would be unjust. However, It would be similarly unjust if the power of the poor demos violates the equally justified claims made by other groups. The challenge is, as already said, to find a balance between competing legitimate claims, which is all the more difficult as the different groups in the city themselves tend to disagree about the relative merit of their peculiar contribution, whether, for example, it is more important to contribute wealth or virtue or freedom. In order to make a constitution agreeable to all groups of citizens, the lawmakers have to consider also the perceived justice, i.e. that members of each group demand to get the amount and type of participation they think to deserve. And this perceived justice might differ in accordance with the population's character or with historical circumstances. Aristotle seems to think that some groups or populations have a stronger and some have a weaker desire for political recognition. This is how I translate philotimia. Accordingly, they demand more or less participation. Aristotle also observes that a particular group's political ambition might be fueled by historical developments. His stock example for this phenomenon is the situation in Athens after the Persian Wars, when the self-esteem of the Athenian demos had grown particularly strong through its significant contributions to Athens' military success. Aristotle seems to think that it was appropriate to some extent to give way to the demos' increased desire for political recognition and to satisfy this desire by granting more participation rights. The perspective of the perceived justice or injustice is also used for arguing that certain regulations would not be tolerable for certain populations due to their particularly proud or ambitious or envious character, while the philotimia of certain other groups or populations can be more easily dealt with. It's particularly easy to deal with populations or groups who, through their character or way of living, have only moderate interest in political affairs or little time to actively engage in politics. So, perceived justice can deviate from objective justice in both directions. People or particular groups can demand more rights owing to their peculiar character and self-esteem, or they can drop participation rights they would be entitled to. While objective justice is a moral demand, the perspective of perceived justice is not. It is either a concession to the difficulty of determining an objective standard of justice within a city, or it is a prudential demand. Prudential from the perspective of the lawmaker who intends to establish a constitution that is stable through being accepted by the majority of citizens and through minimizing sources for internal struggles and unrest. When discussing the political participation of the poor demos, Aristotle often seems to make use of the implicit rule that the poor and uneducated people should be given as many rights as necessary, but not more than that. What is necessary in this sense follows from what we just said before, i.e. from people's justified claims for participation and by what they think to deserve in accordance with their self-esteem and ambition. In cases in which the demos was given more participation rights than necessary, Aristotle often sees this as resulting from the agency of certain demagogues who, for reasons of political opportunism, try to get the support of the many by disempowering former elites and established institutions, just like the old Areopagites were deprived of their power by Ephialtes and Pericles. The rule, as much as necessary, but not more than that, seems to be inspired by Solon's dictum, I gave the demos as much privilege as it is sufficient. Fragment 5. This is at least how Aristotle interprets the intention of Solonian laws. In Politics 2:12, Aristotle points out that Solon's constitution was a mixed one, in that the council on the Areopagus was oligarchic, through property qualification. The offices were elected in accordance with aristocratic standards, while the courts were democratically constituted by the lot. Aristotle approvingly interprets these regulations as follows, quote, Solon himself appears to have given the Athenians only the power of electing the offices, i.e. active, not passive electoral rights, and calling to account the magistrates, which was absolutely necessary. For without it, they would have been in a state of slavery and enmity to the government. Unquote. Even though Aristotle himself seems to be more permissive in granting participation rights to the demos than the Solon type of democracy, provided that the population is prepared for more democratic rights, Aristotle sticks to the rule that it is not advisable to give more participation to the poor mass than necessary. Why is this so? Is he ultimately an aristocrat at heart? It seems strange that on the one hand he's eager to ground political participation in the very concept of state, citizen and political rule, while on the other hand he seems overly concerned not to exaggerate democracy. Here are some arguments that recur throughout his discussion of democracy and that might justify his peculiar position. Some of these arguments are rather philosophically inspired, some others have their origin in the analysis of the Athenian constitution as Aristotle interprets it. And I have 6 such brief arguments. So number 1, I called the unfortunate dynamics of democratization. In books 4 and 6 of the Politics, Aristotle distinguishes 4 or 5 types of democracy. The first type of democracy is said to be the best. It is also said to be the eldest and hence seems to mirror the Solonian limited type of democracy. In the following types of democracy, more and more power is given to the mass of people. But in all of them, except the last one, the rule of law obtains. In the final, most extreme version, the authority of the law is replaced by decrees, psephisma. Aristotle thinks that something like this also holds of the Athenian constitution of his own days. By and large, the sequence of these 4 or 5 types of democracy seem to correspond to the historical development of Athens as the author of the Athenaean Politeia sees it without the tyrannical interludes there. As Aristotle is mostly interested in the first and in the last type of democracy, one might get the impression that he wishes to set up a slippery slope scenario. So once you start loosening the limits of Solon-style democracy, there's no way to stop the dynamics that will lead to the last extreme type of democracy, under the influence of demagogues and people's tendency to gain more wealth and influence. I do not think that Aristotle defends here historical determinism, but at least he sees a recurring pattern of subsequent events that is set in motion whenever someone loosens the legal limits of Solon-style democracy. So argument number 2, class interests. In book 3 of the Politics, democracy is listed among the bad or deviated forms of constitutions, also in book 8 of the Nicomachean Ethics. Why is this so? Because democracy is understood here as the government of the many poor at the cost of the few or fewer wealthy ones. And as we already heard, Aristotle treats all constitutions as deviant in which one group governs for its own benefit at the cost of the other groups. This equally applies to oligarchy and tyranny. So why could that be a particularly urgent problem for democracy? Suggestion? Aristotle again and again mentions that there is a tendency in the rule of the poor mass to neglect the interests of the wealthy ones and, at the end of the day, to get a share of their wealth. Perhaps this is a specific threat for the government of the poor, because the wealthy ones possess what the poor ones are lacking, whereas the wealthy ones themselves are saturated and only try to prevent the poor demos from getting what it wants. If this is so, it would provide an argument for imposing rules onto a democratic constitution that preserves the legitimate interests of those who are not poor and uneducated. Argument number 3, exaggerations of both oligarchy and democracy. All constitutions can be exaggerated. Just as a nose stops looking like a nose when it is either too much snubbed or when it is too much hooked, both exaggerated oligarchy and exaggerated democracy are no longer real constitutions. The latter because it replaces the rule of law, as we already heard, by psephismata. In both cases, these exaggerations come about because people mistakenly think that it is a good thing to put the principles inherent in a particular type of constitution to the extreme. In the case of democracy, this principle is freedom, eleftheria. Democracies with a fading authority of the laws are particularly vulnerable to this kind of exaggeration, as demagogues use the exaggerated application of democratic principles for opportunistic purposes. Again, if this is right, it would provide an argument for protecting democracy against the tendency to be exaggerated. Argument number 4, the interpretation of the democratic principles. The democratic principle of freedom is usually translated, Aristotle says, into 2 slogans. One is the slogan of ruling and being ruled in turn. And one is the slogan of being able to do whatever one wants. For not being able to do what one wants to do is a mark of slavery. So that democratic freedom is supposed to be the opposite, namely doing whatever one fancies. Aristotle endorses the first slogan, ruling and being ruled in turn, because this is a means to giving active participation to the greatest number of people. But he rejects the second slogan as a false interpretation of democratic freedom. It is false in Aristotle's view because it would also threaten the democratic constitution if the constitution fails to define legal limits for what the democratic majority wishes to do. For example, exploiting or suppressing the rich minority. Aristotle also quibbles with the ruling and being ruled slogan, for he argues, in a thoroughly Socratic manner, that it would not be useful if experts like the carpenter and the shoemaker changed their functions in turn. The implication is that at least some positions or offices should be exempted from the principle of ruling and being ruled in turn, and that election by the lot should only apply to offices that do not require experience, as it is practiced in the Athenian constitution. This leads us directly to the next and most important point, what I call, number 5, the competence requirement. In a way, Aristotle's attitude to democracy could be described by the attempt to reconcile the necessity of participation with the competence requirement. To some extent, one might see this as a Platonic heritage. Even though Aristotle does not model the capacity to rule on the ideal of scientific knowledge, he firmly assumes that some amount of competence, experience, and virtue is required in order to administer the highest political offices well. Since the acquisition of these qualifications requires time and education, he sometimes says that it is less likely to find such people among the poor ones than to find them among the prosperous ones. Which, of course, is not to say that Aristotle would expect the rich ones to be decent and virtuous. Aristotle quite openly, therefore, advocates the principle that the dynamenoi, those who are capable of ruling, should rule, and that it is unbearable for the better ones to be ruled by the worse. This does not rule out democracy, but it speaks in favor of mixed constitutions, in which at least some offices should be assigned because of qualification and not in a democratic way by the law. Again, this seems to be one reason for Aristotle to think that cities should not be more democratic than necessary. I come to my final point. It's number 6, the weakness of certain democratic people. Certain democratic people. Poor people have not much time for school and education. This is why, in Aristotle's view, representatives of the poor majority are often unprepared when they become chosen as decision makers and officials. In addition, the poor ones, Aristotle seems to think, are more prone to certain kinds of wicked or criminal behavior. Psychological assumptions seems to be that the poor ones have nothing to lose when they see an opportunity to enrich themselves. This is, as we have already seen, one reason why Aristotle takes it for granted that democracies based on a poor themos have the tendency to turn into democratic tyrannies. And it is also the reason why Aristotle advocates in Politics 4:11 the society with a strong middle class, in which most people have moderate possessions. This is the general picture. Aristotle adds one important and somewhat surprising qualification to it in books 4 and 6 of the Politics, when he describes at some length the best democracy as consisting of relatively poor farmers who spend most of their time outside or at the margin of the city and have not much time to deal with political matters. Next to the agricultural democracy comes the pastoral democracy, in which the majority of people are shepherds. All these people have to work hard for their living. They are relatively poor, but their lifestyle contributes to the stability of the polis. Aristotle sharply contrasts these people with the urban craftsmen, merchants, and day laborers who spend the day in the city center and keep coming to the assemblies. Aristotle repeatedly insists that the difference between the agricultural and pastoral themos on the one hand and these urban democrats on the other cause a major difference in the type and quality of democracy. Democracy suffers under the impact of the second group. Why is this so? Well, I suspect that those urban people who have too much time for politics are deluded into thinking that they should improve their own situation, above all by political reforms, or by parliamentary and judicial allowances, mistos, without caring about the best decisions in all these assemblies. In addition, they are vulnerable to demagogues, again, who keep flattering them. Even though this is an important point for Aristotle, very important point, he does not really develop on the characterization of these urban craftsmen and merchants. I suspect that his strong verdict about these people, he says their life is faulos, so I suspect that his strong verdict reflects his personal experience in Athens, and that he takes for granted that his audience knows exactly what he is talking about. Another connection with Athenian politics is given by the fact that the author of the Athenaeum Politeia interprets Pisistratos' efforts to give property to the poor ones just as the attempt to keep them away from the city center and from daily politics. To conclude, Aristotle endorses political participation, and he gives philosophical and prudential reasons that support democratic participation. Still, he has qualms about establishing too much participation for people who are inept. This seems the reason why he assesses various types of democracy by versions of the Solonian formula to grant only the necessary amount of participation to the themos. For the conflict between the participation of all citizens on the one hand and the competence virtue requirement on the other, he finds the ingenious theoretical solution that we know from his famous summation or accumulation argument in Politics 3:11. Here he argues that under certain circumstances and for certain purposes, the accumulated competence or wisdom may even outweigh the judgment of the few virtuous or wise men in the city. One might see this as another example of Aristotle's talent to see a rational basis for things that happen inescapably in the reality he lives in. But even so, it's a very clever move. That ordinary people are not good legislators or do not qualify for certain offices is not an argument for disputing their genuine collective competence in judging the impact of laws and magistrates on their lives. Just as the fact that we are not architects is not an argument for disputing our competence in assessing the comfort of a house. By distinguishing several types of competences and virtues related to the life in the city, and by appealing to the superiority of the collected accumulated competence in some kinds of questions, Aristotle opens up a wide range of possibilities to participate in a democratic city, many of which are mentioned in the Athenaion Politeia, without, though, abandoning the competence requirement. Thank you very much.
We started late, so we do have some time for questions. Carol, would you like to start?
Thank you. Thanks. That was a very thorough survey of what Aristotle contributed to our understanding of ancient political philosophy. I wondered, you referenced Solon quite often, and I wondered if you might say a bit more about the way in which Aristotle and other people in the time looked back to and idealized, even reinvented, that idea of there being a past perfect version of democracy, one that we've deteriorated from. You mentioned the Areopagus, and at points what you were saying almost seems to me to be paralleling Aristotle with Socrates' thought in works like the Areopagus, where he emphasizes the important role of the more superior citizen in contributing more to the rule of the city. And that, of course, is the work in which Socrates says that the politeia is the soul of the city, which seemed to be a view that you were disagreeing with. So I thought I had two separate questions, but they turn out to be the same one.
Okay, to start with the last point. I mean, of course, politeia can be said to be the soul of the city, but I mean, to be fair, this cannot be meant in a literal biological sense, and cities do not have a soul in this biological, literal sense because they're living beings. That was my point, which was more related to so interpretations of politics on too, but I do not dispute that the politeia gives, so as it were, the distinctive character to each polis. I do not know where this idea comes from. So it's a good question. I like this question. I do not know. I have no sources for influences on Aristotle in this respect. By what people he was influenced in thinking that there was such a development. And so what comes across as an innocent registering of different constitutions in the Athenaion Politeia turns out to be a very peculiar interpretation of what happened and why it happened. There were 11 changes of the constitution, and he always refers back to this motive that there is this original innocent one, which was absolutely necessary according to the Solonian formula, but that then for, avoidable reasons, often opportunistic reasons, changes were made, wrong decisions were made that led to the loosening, above all, of the power of law.
Yeah, and also he downplays, because they weren't formally metaboli, complete changes of constitution, the many changes in the 4th century, which precisely did increase the number of appointed offices, did limit the power of the assembly. So it is quite a partisan account of Athenian democracy. I think sometimes we think it's more neutral than it is.
I wouldn't say that it's impartial, though. Yeah, no, that's right. I agree.
Fuller has something on this.
Yeah, it's very closely related.
Mm.
I mean, it's a question. I wonder whether you can say something more about how Aristotle views the city as a collective agent, if he does. I mean, is it more than the sum of the citizens? How does he understand the city decided? I was wondering whether you could say something more about that. And then a suggestion, the reason, or one reason why he may prefer agriculturalists and shepherds to those working in the city, the demos. Ronald Knox, the historian, he has done work on the rate of casualty, of punishment, either by confiscation of goods, or by exile, or by death, of magistrates that are appointed magistrates on the basis of their expertise from the demos. And the specification is that these kinds of trades constitute the vast majority of the demos. And the casualty rate is something like 50%. So that surely falls within Aristotle's experience.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. I mean, it seems somewhat paradoxical that he, on the one hand, endorses participation and makes participation an essential characteristic of each polis that deserves the name. And on the other hand, seems to be happy not to have too much participation by certain groups. But I think even his remarks about the farmers and the shepherds are not meant to say that they are not integrated in the decision-making process. They have to be integrated. And it's owing to particular constitutions that all these individual preferences are translated into a decision that is kurion, authoritative, and that allows us to say it is the city that acts and not a particular group or a particular citizen within the city. So it's a collective decision making that follows the rule of the particular constitution, which defines the conditions for saying this is a city's decision. So only if it follows the rules of this particular constitution.
I know that we have 2 more questions, but I don't know whether we have the time.
Yeah, if they are short, yes.
Okay, Andrew.
Thank you for a very lucid and compelling analysis. What do you think are the implications of your analysis for what Aristotle might say about modern representative democracy?
Yeah, I mean,
Small.
Very short. Very short.
As you see, I'm not an historian, but I mean, philosophically, I see this as a precursor of, I mean, the idea of restricting participation to, for example, election of officials, and very important, this efthenia, so calling them to the magistrates to account. I mean, this is a way of being represented by the officials you choose and to hold them responsible for what you are doing in your name. Do you think that's plausible, or?
Okay, no, I think he is laying down some stepping stones for the transition from direct to representative democracy.
Right.
Thank you.
Just a short and maybe naive question. In which way, according to Aristotle, parents who are free and citizens of a city can give to their children the minimal qualifications and the faculty of choice, which is so important for them to become free and citizens?
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. I mean, I just can say that I think that this idea is like, or this concept, even in Aristotle's Politics, is like ambivalent. In that, on the one hand, it's really, so what you get from your parents is in the first place the social status, not more than that. And I refer to the conventional rules of acknowledging this social status. And either you are free or not. And this can or cannot come with a qualification behind that. And the qualification would consist in actually having the faculty to make choices, which is not a trivial thing. But of course, people are not checked when they are acknowledged to be free-born, whether they have the qualification of using their pro-irises in the right way. But I mean, Aristotle, of course, quite often hints to the fact that it affects the quality of a city, whether people do or do not have competence behind the social status.
Lucas.
Yeah, thank you. I got some feedback on a point you hinted at, I think, in points 3 to 5. So this is the point. Let us assume that there is, in fact, a conspiracy of the many,
Yes.
which are neither virtuous nor rich, and under perhaps the influence of a demagogue, have played the Eleftheria card instead of the Toulouse card. So surely there must be a narrative embellishing this whole argument. It cannot be that the demagogue does not say to them, just make a coup. So some kind of making sound as the right thing to do per se, or some utilitarian reasons. This is the right thing for the city, not for the many, which we now conspire. So does Aristotle addresses, gives testimony, gives an account of this embellishing argument and addressing, or
I mean, are you asking me whether he refers to historical examples
of some rhetoric who presents what he thinks to be a coup as the right thing to do?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, there are these short versions of Athenian history in Book 2 of the Politics, and the longer versions in Athenaion Politeia, and I think they hint to historical persons who contributed to the loosening of democratic rules as demagogues, which sometimes is and sometimes is not a question of rhetoric. He says that it's only the recent development of rhetoric that makes demagogues rhetoricians, whereas in the old days these were strategoi, so people come from the military rather than from the rhetorical schools.
But does he reproduce their arguments?
Yes.
Does he reproduce their arguments? Okay.
Wonderful. It was fair to give some more time to Aristotle, I think. So thank you very much.